This young lady's name is Donna Halper. She's an author, an educator, a media historian, a radio consultant. It seems like she's been in radio since 1912.
No, it's 1911.
1911. So anyway, Donna, you want to come up here?
I predicted that.
Wake up this audience for me.
It's too late.
Here, stay in the corner, you gotta go over.
You told me you'd pay me. I'm a professor at Lesley University. I just got my PhD last year at the age of 64. Okay. The fastest growing demographic right now of people going back to school is older adults. So if you've been sitting around for years thinking, boy, you know, I always wish I'd gotten a, pick one, bachelor's, master's, doctorate, they're waiting for you. They really are. There are schools that are setting up schools just for older learners and just for returning learners. Fact checking. Advice your mother gave you, I'm going to give you some advice. If your mother says she loves you, check it out. And I say that kindly. Mom may have gotten the information wrong. Okay? I loved my mother. She was a wonderful person. If there's a heaven, she's there. No doubt in my mind. And yet, she heard stuff incorrectly. She got information that wasn't right. There is so much false information out there today, and there are people trying to scare you because they think you're stupid. You are not stupid. Don't be scared. Check out the facts. And the first thing you should be asking yourself when you see one of these scary political ads, you know, my opponent is going to take away me. Well, maybe they're right. Maybe the person is going to take it away. But don't take their word for it because they have an agenda. And those little political ads you see, and in fairness, both sides do it. Some are more accurate than others, but they are meant to, in 30 seconds, terrify you. Like Sarah Palin saying they were death panels in the healthcare law. No, they weren't. Okay, the healthcare law is online. You can read it yourself. You can see that there's nothing in there about death panels. And yet there are people who truly came to believe it because they saw it in an ad. So when you see some of those ads, there's two things you need to do. Thing number one, you need to ask yourself, who sponsored this ad? Because in many cases they have these lovely names like the Committee to Protect Trees, you know, the Committee to Smell Flowers. And then you do a little investigating and you find out that it's, pick one, an oil company or a political party or a group that has an agenda that would make millions if you voted a certain way. How do you find out the facts? There are 3 non-partisan websites that I recommend. And when I say nonpartisan, they're not righty, they're not lefty, they have no agenda, no horse in the race other than fact-checking, which is something I believe in 100%. One of them is called Snopes.com. And I will be very happy to send to Charlie or send to anybody else that wants it the links to the really good fact-checking sites, so that when you see some of these scary things in ads, or when you receive mailers from candidates, Candidate X wants to take away your children, you know, you'll be able to like look it up and go, he or she said no such thing, what? You know? So the informed person is the person who is going to vote wisely rather than voting on emotion or voting on lies. And Snopes.com is a wonderful website. Another very good website is factcheck.org. Factcheck.org. And the third one that I recommend is politifact.com. Okay, in fact, PolitiFact is so good it won a Pulitzer Prize last year. Okay? All 3 of these sites spend their lives fact-checking information that is floating around the internet. Everything from death panels to the president's not a citizen to, you know, this candidate said blah-de-blah. There are also a number of local newspapers and national ones, including the Washington Post, including the New York Times, including to some degree the Boston Globe. And the other thing I will say to you is I will be happy to fact-check any claim for you. I'm pretty busy, but I'm never too busy to support accuracy. So if you see something, if you got mailed something, and you tried to check it out, but you got nowhere, send it to Auntie Donna. And I will be very happy to tell you if this is just the same old, or if there's any facts behind it, because we do want to vote based on facts rather than on one candidate or the other trying to manipulate you. Okay? I mean, Daniel Patrick Moynihan said, everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but no one is entitled to their own facts. And yet, unfortunately, that's what we have today. We have people that only watch Fox News and they think the facts are this. We have people that only watch MSNBC and they think the facts are that. But we no longer have shared facts. And I think that's kind of a sad thing, and I think it's kind of a loss for us all. I don't know if I brought it with me. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. But I had there's a really wonderful TV guide picture that I have of the late, great Edward R. Murrow. And I'm telling you, some of the news coverage today, the poor guy he's not just spinning, he's doing pirouettes in his grave, okay? Because he was, how many people really knew what political party he was in? How many people knew what political party Walter Cronkite was in? He had no idea, because they kept it out of the news. I'm sorry, but I'm old school. I can't get used to people that claim to be news people taking a side in political stories. I just don't think they should. I really don't. And it's sad, but there you are. So that's my little rant for today. Forgive me for being boring, but I really do think fact-checking is important. So let's go back, way back, to history, because I like history. I'm a big fan of history. And one of the things I'm a big fan of is the real history of radio, okay? Now, a lot of people, and some of you have heard me talk before, a lot of people have been told that KDKA in Pittsburgh was the first radio station. Horse pucky. It was not. It was probably the third, it might have even been the fourth. And yet, why do so many history books say that it was the first? Because they had a tremendous publicity department. History, as it turns out, is not only told by the winners, it's told by the winners' publicists. And there's an awful lot of facts about history that people have completely forgotten. Or they've accepted the telling of them the way one side or the other side wanted it told. KDKA was owned by Westinghouse, and they were known for their appliances. And when they put their radio station on the air in November of 1920, they were determined to let everybody know that they were the first radio, not just in the United States, in the world. Oh, somebody took Canada out of the world, because Canada had a radio station a year earlier. And I guess Argentina, not in the world. They had a station a year before that. And as far as the fact that they were the first station in the United States, I love them, they're great. Detroit, okay? Probably the first station that we really can prove was on the air was AMK, which is still on the air today as WWJ in Detroit, one of the oldest stations in the United States. It was on the air 3.5 months before KDKA. And then there was my favorite little radio station, little 1XE, WGI, long gone, long forgotten. You know that children's book, The Lorax? I am the Lorax, I speak for the trees. Well, I am the Lorax, I speak for 1XE WGI. Because there's no one left to speak for them anymore. And I want the truth about what that little station did to be known. Because it has a North Shore connection. It associated itself with GE, which used to be in Lynn. Some of you may remember. It associated itself with Tufts College, which in those days, now it's Tufts University, but it was on Medford Hillside. And we have evidence that little 1XE, and the X stood for experimental. Back in the early days of broadcasting, you didn't get call letters like we have today. You got letters and numbers, because the government thought that radio was going to be an experiment, so they handed out X calls. So you'll see a lot of early stations with X's in their name. It didn't mean like X marks the spot. It meant experimental. So you had 1XE. The 1 stood for New England. Okay? You heard me say 8MK. 8MK, the 8 stood for the Midwest. So whatever part of the country you were in, you got either an experimental call, or in the case of 8MK, they got like a letter call because they were run by a newspaper. Okay, so depending on who you were run by. Now, what's fascinating to me, and what people, my students sometimes are like, why should I care? Accuracy's a good thing. And I guess my attitude is, wow, if they'll mislead you about one thing, who knows what else they'll mislead you about. Facts matter. And the fact is that while I salute the folks at KDKA who are still on the air, I salute them, not the same folks obviously, or they'd be really old, but I'm saying the station is on the air, God bless them. And they have kind of backed off of the first radio station in the world because the fact checkers, including me, went at them relentlessly about that. So now they're kind of like, well, we were the first station to have a license. Not. The first station to have a license was, wait for it, WBZ in Boston, which in those days was WBZ in Springfield. And you may say, how do you know that, Don? Well, I'm WBZ's historian. If you go on their website and look for the history of WBZ, I wrote that. So when I did the research about WBZ's history, yes, it is true, WBZ was not in Boston. Dazzle your friends at parties. WBZ was in Springfield until 1924. And in 1924, WBZ had to move and create a Boston studio. Who can tell me why? Why do you think that WBZ, which started, had to do with the Times? And I don't mean the New York Times. Do we have superhighways back then? We do not. So let's say that I'm a performer. Am I performing in Springfield? I'm like a famous vocalist, I'm a famous band leader, I'm a famous whatever. Where am I performing? Boston. Absolutely. And WBZ in Springfield is throwing money at me and saying, you know, please Irving Berlin, please come to Springfield in the springtime. You know, and it's snowy and it's rainy and it's this and it's that. And I want to get on the road and travel for like 2.5 hours to get to Springfield. I don't think I do. Okay? And this was becoming more and more of a problem. When radio first went on the air, when it was little 1XE WGI, okay, back in 1920, and we really do have evidence that 1XE WGI was on the air before both KDKA and 8MK. Problem? Hard to prove it because all of the records for 1XE WGI were lost in a fire. All we have is newspaper articles, memories of people that worked there or that knew people that worked there, and me. Because I go around the country telling the truth about that little radio station, which was a pioneering station. It was only on the air for about 5 years because radio was expensive to do in the early days, and you were mostly volunteers. The stations that were owned by the big companies, like Westinghouse, like General Electric, they had the money to pay their talent. But the little stations, the 1XE WGIs and some of the others, WRES in Wollaston, yes, there was a station in Wollaston, which is Quincy, okay, 1926, WRES, the Wollaston Radio Electric Shop. Radio was the home of a lot of dreams for a lot of people, and a lot of small business people just put a station on the air. My favorite is probably Marie Zimmerman, and I'm very happy that I was the first person to tell her story. It's not like, aren't I swell? I'm saying, these people deserve our thanks. They created our industry. We should remember them. Marie Zimmerman was a businesswoman, and she was the first woman to own a radio station back in August of 1922. Okay? And she had one of these rare egalitarian marriages. Her husband, Bob Zimmerman, was the chief electrician, which in those days was like an engineer for the city of Vinton, Iowa. And he was 100% okay about his wife working, which in 1922 was pretty unusual, okay? He was not only okay about it, he was like, well, what do you want to do? And she's like, well, I'm really interested in this new thing called radio, and I've been like putting on my headphones and like hearing all these stations, but we don't have a station. And Vinton, Iowa should have a radio station. Everybody else has got one, how come we don't have one? So he was like, I'll tell you what, I'll build it. I'm the engineer here. But you're the businesswoman, you run it. And that's exactly what happened. So he built a radio station for her. He built the whole, all the equipment and this and that. She knew how to repair it. She just didn't know how to build it because she'd never been to school for that kind of stuff. But boy, she knew business. And he even built a portable version. He put it in a truck. And he would drive around Vinton, Iowa, letting everybody see his wife on the radio. He was so proud. Until I researched it, found it, and was able to tell it. And it is still probably online somewhere on there's a library website that, in Vinton, Iowa. But if you do a search for Marie Zimmerman and my name, that story will come up. And there's a whole bunch of those early stories. But my point is this. After about a year and 3 months, they had to go off the air. They couldn't afford to get talent. They couldn't afford to keep paying the electric bill. They couldn't afford to do much of anything. It was all volunteers, and the stations that were run by companies that could take people were stealing all the talent. So WBZ out in Springfield was having that problem. They could pay people, but nobody could get there. I mean, Bob Zimmerman had a great idea. He put a station in a truck and just drove it around to people. But it was kind of hard to do that, okay? So WBZ gets the brilliant idea, we need a Boston studio. And they opened one up in February of 1924. And I always ask my students this, they opened it up in a hotel. Why did a lot of the early stations, and in fact even into the 1940s, why did a lot of stations open up in hotels?
That's where people were.
For one thing, you've got a built-in crowd if you want a studio audience. And for another thing, you had a built-in band. Radio was live, okay? So let's say that I've got, Joe Gazoxtehagen coming in to tell jokes, and Joe gets stuck in traffic and doesn't show up. If I'm in a hotel, what do? I put a call out to the house band and say, hey, how would you like to get some free publicity? Oh, and by the way, we'll pay you. And the house band, who's there anyway, they come on, they're on the air, bada bing, bada boom, there's no dead air. One of the worst problems in early broadcasting was dead air, okay? So, yes, it had been invented in laboratories, but it doesn't get really perfected until Jack Mullen, who was a captain in the service, saw some experiments that the Nazis were doing and decided to put them to a good purpose, brought them back to the United States, the experiments, perfected them, and then we started getting audio tape. But not until the late 40s. People send me emails all the time because I'm WBZ's historian. My grandma, my grandpa, my whoever was on the air in 1922. Can you send me a tape of it? And the answer is always the same. No. And the reason I can't is not because I'm a horrible person. You may think I'm a horrible person. But the truth is, there was nothing to record them on. There was no audio tape. The first thing we get that will allow you to tape anything is in 1929, when a guy by the name of Ray Soet, who came from Omaha, S-O-A-T, he came from Omaha, and he came up with this brilliant idea which led to transcribing. Some of you may remember hearing on the radio, hearing a program, recorded and transcribed, which means that they went to a studio, recorded it, put it on a big disc, which moved real slowly, and the program was recorded that way. A lot of stations didn't want to do it. It was expensive, it took a while, not everybody had a studio, so not everybody did it, and sadly, the first 15 or 18 years of broadcasting are largely lost to us. There are a few recordings, a few. But there's also tons of things online that claim to be recordings, and in reality they're recreations. They're like people doing it later and then, I talk about my cultural hero, the late great Eunice Randall. And Eunice Randall was our first woman announcer, and she was also a ham radio operator. She was one of the earliest women ham radio operators in Massachusetts. She wasn't the earliest, but I was friends for 40 years with the late, great David Rudnoy. Okay? I think David Rudnoy was one of the best talk show hosts ever. And I say that as somebody who rarely agreed with David politically. Okay? David was much more of a righty than I am. I'm sort of center-left on most issues. I'm righty on a few issues, but I'm kind of center-left on most. I'm very issues-oriented, depending on the issue, blah, blah, blah. But I never heard David Rudnoy insult or yell at or call names of the people he disagreed with. He was the last of the courteous talk show hosts. Now, I'm not saying he wasn't passionate. I'm not saying he didn't get excited about the subject. But his best friend was Ted Kennedy. Okay? So here's a guy who's like a conservative Republican, and his best friend is the king of the liberals, Ted Kennedy. And they were really good friends. Back in the era when compromise wasn't a dirty word. Back in the era when you treated your opponent with courtesy. When you were passionate about the issues but you didn't insult people. I miss that kind of radio. Am I the only one? I'm very serious. And I'm not dissing the people that are on today. I know Dan Ray, he's a very nice man. But I'm saying that some of the talk show hosts from that era understood. And in fact, the way they used to do it, radio stations would have a righty, then they'd have a lefty. Then they'd have a righty, then they'd have a lefty, because of something called the fairness doctrine. Having a microphone is a responsibility. It should be used wisely. You've been a wonderful audience. I have no idea if there's stuff that you wanted me to talk about. But I hope I talked about some things that were halfway interesting, because I could go on indefinitely. If you want me back, I'll come back. They may be by the word too. And I will stick around for two reasons. Reason number one, because I hear the food's good, and I hear there's going to be a fully catered lunch with pheasant under glass. In fact, I think I see the truck is out back there now. They're catching the pheasants right now. And thing number two, because if you're a friend of radio, you're a friend of mine. And my website is www.donnahalper.com. There's very easy ways to get a hold of me. And as I said, you want to buy my book, I'll be happy to sell it to you, $20 and I autograph it. If you want to just buy it online and save yourself, whatever you want to save, or go to bookstores, that's nice too. This is a full history of everything that happened in radio from day one up to the present, with my cultural hero, Arnie Ginsberg, on the front page. And one last story, if you don't mind. This is a promise I made. When I was a kid, I was a very lonely kid. No, I wasn't. I was the only Jew in my neighborhood at a time when society still hadn't quite gotten over like anti-Semitism. We kind of weren't there yet, okay? And I went through a lot of stuff that I'd rather not get into here, but let's just say that I encountered a lot of prejudice. And the other thing I encountered was I was a girl wanting a career at a time when it wasn't quite, the women's movement hadn't quite come along yet. I was like about 10 years early. And while I ended up being a second wave feminist, I had to persuade a lot of people that it was okay for me to go to college, and it was okay for me to have a career that wasn't teacher, nurse, or secretary. And I didn't want to do a cooking show. I was very happy for Louise Morgan. I loved Louise Morgan. I used to listen to her. But I wasn't interested in what she wanted to do. I wanted to play the hits, and I wanted to do news. And there weren't a lot of women doing those things. And I was always told that the reason I couldn't do them was because I didn't have a big, deep voice. Because to be a hit on the radio, you had to have a big, deep voice. And then along came Arnie Ginsberg. And Arnie didn't have a big, deep voice. He kind of talked like this. And yet, he was the #1 DJ in Boston. He had fun. He enjoyed himself. You didn't hear him tell dirty jokes. You really didn't, okay? But he was entertaining, he was hilarious, and he had a good time doing radio. And I said, wow, if he can do it, I can do it. And he became my inspiration for going into radio. And I made a promise, and I must tell you, I kept it. I made a promise that if I ever did get into radio, I would write a book about the history of radio, and I would put Arnie on the cover. And a couple of years ago, when I finished doing my research, I called Arnie up. He's still alive. He's like 80. He's retired in Maine. And I called him up, and I said, I never met you. I mean, I saw you at events, but I never I'm not Dr. Craig Earl's claiming to be like a doctor from Harvard or Tufts. So I never met you. I just saw you. But I loved your radio shows, and as a lonely kid with no friends who was dealing with being ahead of her time, you were such an inspiration to me. And I'd like to put you on the cover of my book. I found a picture of you at a flea market, and I bought it. And I would like you to give me your permission, since it's your image. Could I put you on the cover of my book? And he was like, wow, my show meant that much to you? I said, yeah, because when radio's done right, it means a lot to people. Am I lying about that? How many of you remember radio shows that you listen to and DJs that you enjoy and music? And absolutely. So this is my way of saying thank you. And I want to say thank you to all of you again for listening.
Thank you.
Boo Lonnie Ginsberg was one of my inspirations for meeting my wife. Because we always listen to that while we run our way to the open air theater.
Absolutely.
Right?
And Adventure Car Hop is the place to go for you. Adventure food is always just so you relish every bite. Come on. Outer go on and saw. Yes, come dressed just as you are. Adventure where the service is tops and you never get out of your car.